If you believe in democracy, if you believe in the rule of law, then you're going to find this next story important, because at the United States Supreme Court level, we have our second and final brief for the Supreme Court to declare once and for all whether Donald Trump was right or wrong to invoke war powers during a phony war in order to kidnap and deport people without due process to the dark, dank, notoriously lethal prisons of El Salvador. Is that the country that we live in? Is that the rule of law? And is that our democracy? Yes or no, Supreme Court? You got your second brief. I'm going to go over what it means now having been filed by the American Civil Liberties Union. I'll tell you in advance that one thing that Chief Justice Roberts did not do, which is not great for the Trump administration, but great for rule of law and democracy, is that he did not temporarily block the injunction imposed by Judge Boesberg below at the D.C. District Court level to stop the use of the Alien Enemies Act to be used for deportation purposes while they were getting the briefing together. Oftentimes he does that. Doesn't mean much. It's just an administrative stay, but he didn't even do that. So all of the people that you've heard that have been deported since this injunction, like the 13 more that went to this El Salvadorian prison, they were done presumably, purportedly under another body of law, not the Alien Enemies Act. I'm Michael Popok. You're on the MeidasTouch Network. Let's talk about the opposition to the application just filed. Let's talk procedure first. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court turned it over to the full panel, the full 9 of the Supreme Court, to decide whether they found the application by the Trump administration filed on the 28th of March even interesting. Their issue was, we want you to block Judge Boesberg's decision, which was upheld 2-1 by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, led by Judge Millett and Judge Henderson, who found in principle that a migration is not an invasion, that a uncoordinated group of drug gang members is not the equivalent of us going to war with Venezuela. And you can't use the magical superpowers of the war power of the Alien Enemies Act, the only alien act left since the 1790s, to deport people without due process. And we now have all the reporting of just how deep and dark that hole is in El Salvador. It is so deep and dark that the Trump administration admitted that they sent the wrong guy there through an administrative error, another glitch, and they can't get him back. I thought they had good, close foreign relationships and agreements with the president of El Salvador, Bukele. Apparently not, because this person was here on an asylum application and petition, and an immigration judge ordered that he remain in the country. They accidentally put him on the plane because they're incompetent. And now they claim, well, we can't get him out. And worse, we can't get him out, and you, judge, can't do a darn thing about it because you don't have jurisdiction over El Salvador. See where we're going with this? That's the backdrop for what's just been filed. 2 pieces of paper is all that's going to be used by the Supreme Court. They almost never hold oral argument about an emergency application. And the only issue up on appeal is not fundamentally the merits of the appeal, although it really is. It's not whether Donald Trump properly has war power or not, although it is. It's about whether the judge below, as affirmed by the D.C. Appellate Court, was right to enjoin or block for now, while he got his arms around the preliminary injunction, the next stop on the next up on the food chain of injunctions, which is going to conclude sometime in middle April. In other words, what is the rush? As this new brief by the American Civil Liberties Union, and I'll read it to you in a minute, parts of it, what they say is, what is the rush? The irreparable harm to the Venezuelans sent to El Salvador is tremendous and can't be overstated. Death, going into a black hole never to be heard from again, no due process whatsoever. No way, even though the government has admitted, the Trump administration has admitted these people are entitled to some due process under the Alien Enemies Act to determine whether they are or not members of that gang, even if the gang is some sort of predatory invasion or incursion or war combatants. How do you prove that? So on the one hand, Trump says, well, yeah, they have the right to prove it. On the other hand, they say, well, no, they're in El Salvador now and we can't get them back. That's a problem for the Trump position at the United States Supreme Court, I assure you. That's not going to go over well, I don't think, with Amy Coney Barrett and probably with Chief Justice Roberts. The other ones are so far gone. The far alt-right, right wing, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, they're like, that's like, and Kavanaugh too, they're like 4 votes. It's going to be a 5-4 decision. Could be 6-3. Could shock me. I'll come back and talk about it. Here, let me read to you from, so you know what's at stake, what the stakes are here. Let me read to you from a couple of the more pertinent pages of the filing, and then I'll tell you what happens next. Page 1. The government has not satisfied its exceedingly high burden to warrant the extraordinary relief it seeks at the Supreme Court, vacating an unappealable temporary restraining orders that merely preserve the status quo while a pending preliminary injunction motion is decided on an expedited basis. Like, what's the rush? The TRO does not order anyone's release, nor does it prevent the government from carrying out regular removals under the Immigration and Nationality Act, which they're doing. In contrast, without the TRO, plaintiffs will suffer extraordinary and irreparable harm, being sent out of the United States to a notorious Salvadoran prison where they will remain incommunicado potentially for the rest of their lives without having had any opportunity to contest their designation as gang members. And that is from Judge Henderson at the appellate court level from a week or so ago. The government cannot explain why the equities are in its favor, which is what they have to do for this application, since it now concedes that the individuals are entitled to contest their designation as being members of the Tren de Aragua, which is a northern section of Venezuela, gang. The fight there, just to bring you up to speed, is whether this should have been brought as a writ of habeas corpus, where the person was to bring them into court, but the person is no longer in Texas where they were processed. They were sent in the middle of the night to El Salvador, and that is the problem. Now, let me read to you from page 4 of the brief. Moreover, as even the limited TRO record below demonstrates. See, when a record below is limited, Supreme Courts get antsy because they're not the courts of original jurisdiction, right? They're courts of appeal. They want a full record. This is why this is probably not a Supreme Court reviewable temporary restraining order. It should really stay with Judge Boesberg until he gets through the preliminary injunction stage. But they continue. The government has already hurried hundreds of individuals onto planes to El Salvador. Listen to this next part on page 4. Without providing advance notice, let alone an opportunity to contest their deportation. The document individuals may have been asked to sign before being staged for removal expressly stated that no hearing, appeal, or judicial review was permitted regarding their designation. So that's a lie. In fact, the government began staging non-citizens for removal under the Alien Enemies Act even before the proclamation was posted on the White House website. It continues to take the position that it need not provide notice to individuals. So, in other words, no due process. Since then, they have been confined incommunicado in one of the most brutal prisons in the world, where torture and other human rights abuses are rampant, and were there any doubt about how these men will be treated, the Salvadoran president released a video reposted by President Trump and Secretary Rubio showing them being brutalized immediately upon departing their U.S. aircraft, showing Nayib Bukele on X at 8:13, showing this video. The Salvadoran president has stated, moreover, that the men, in fact, let me take a moment and show that video of what was posted on Bukele's X on March 16, 2025. Let's roll it. The Salvadoran president has stated, moreover, that the men will remain imprisoned there for the remainder of their lives without access to the outside world. And it is becoming increasingly clear that many, perhaps most of the men, were not actually members of Tren de Aragua and were instead erroneously designated as such, in large part because of their tattoos, a wholly unreliable means of identifying membership in a particular gang. The TRO is thus essential to ensure that more individuals who have no affiliation with the gang will not be sent to a notorious foreign prison. We already have reporting that women were sent there, and they don't accept women in this notorious. It's so bad they don't even accept women in that jail. All right? It's so bad that the American government now is saying, we can't get him back, even though we sent somebody by accident. What does that tell you? Everything you need to know. Then the brief goes through all the factors that are necessary for the Trump administration to prove in order to win and to get a block of the injunction while we're waiting for the preliminary injunction hearing to conclude. That's why I think you're going to see, I could be wrong. My prediction is this week, we're going to see a ruling, could be the beginning of next week, that sides with Boesberg for now and says, finish your work. It's reviewable. What you're doing is reviewable. In other words, federal courts have a role in reviewing whether the exercise of the War Powers Act is right or wrong. Review it, make a record. They have the right to appeal to the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, and then we'll see you at another time, but not now. That's what I think should happen by at least a 5-4 vote. 5-4 vote, could be higher. Here's what they said on page 24 of their brief, which sort of summarizes it. The AEA, which is the Alien Enemies Act, has only ever been invoked in times of declared war. Defendants now seek to invoke this limited wartime authority to execute summary removals wholly untethered to any actual or imminent war or to the specific conditions Congress placed in the statute. When the government asserts an unheralded power, courts agree that it must be met with skepticism. They then went on to say that, as Judge Henderson observed, there is no invasion or predatory incursion upon the United States. Starting with contemporaneous dictionary definitions, it is clear that Congress understood those terms to mean a military intrusion into the territory of the United States. About other contemporary founding era usages of the term are in accord. In other words, you can't use migration and immigration as your trigger for using the Alien Enemies Act, which only allows its use if there is a predatory incursion or invasion, which is later followed by a declaration of war. And does anybody really believe there's going to be a congressional declaration of war against Venezuela or against Tren de Aragua, a narcotics gang? I get they may be bad people, but as this brief and all the other briefs have said, send them through the INS process. Give them their day in court. Give them a judge. Give them a defense lawyer, and prove your case. And if you prove it, I don't really care where you send them after that. You want to send them to El Salvador? I mean, I don't like it from a Democratic Republic supporter like me. But once they're convicted and through appeal, I don't want to torture them. There are Geneva Conventions, by the way. So we're going to continue to follow what happens next. Fast-moving story. Next stop on the train this week, I think, or maybe early next week, is going to be the ruling by the United States Supreme Court. And it means a lot to our beating heart of our democracy, what they rule. I'll cover it here on the MeidasTouch Network and on Legal AF. Until my next report. In collaboration with the MeidasTouch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.